Welcome to The Explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled you're joining me today because we are going to unpack a truly fascinating topic. We're looking closely at the logical dilemma behind Islam. Specifically, this is a highly structured, almost puzzle-like logical construct that gets used a lot in interfaith debates between Christians and Muslims. You'll often hear it called the Islamic Dilemma or the Quranic Dilemma. Today, we are going to impartially examine the mechanics, the history, and the academic critiques of this argument, drawing on some fantastic detailed research by Mark Bates. To kick things off, I really want you to consider this central question. What actually happens when sacred texts collide? I mean, what happens when the foundational claims of one religion directly intersect with the historically preserved texts of another? Now, you might be wondering why this matters. Well, it fundamentally changes how we view historical debates. This isn't just about competing personal beliefs. It's about what a text explicitly says about other texts. And that is the exact friction point we're exploring today.
Here is our quick roadmap for today. We'll be covering the core scriptural tension, the anatomy of the dilemma, a journey from antiquity to algorithms, the tactical deployment, strengths and limitations, and finally, the ultimate theological goal. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the core scriptural tension, looking at affirmation versus contradiction.
So this entire argument actually builds its foundation right from the Quran's own internal claims. The Quran repeatedly and explicitly affirms the divine inspiration, the historical preservation, and the binding authority of the prior scriptures. Specifically, it points to the Hebrew Torah, or Torah, and the Christian Gospel, or Injil. For example, Surah Al-Imran states that Allah revealed these texts aforetime as a guidance for mankind. And what's super interesting is that the Arabic phrasing here actually implies the physical presence and immediate proximity of these prior scriptures right at the time of the recitation.
And it actually goes a step further. In Surah Yunus, the text directs its own prophet with this striking command. If he is in doubt concerning the revelations delivered to him, he must consult those who have been reading the book before thee. This cements a direct built-in reliance on these prior books. The Quran is essentially treating the scriptures possessed by 7th century Jews and Christians as highly reliable benchmarks.
But here is exactly where that tension arises. Historically documented 7th century biblical manuscripts, we're talking about massive, famous codices like Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus, are continuously documented from antiquity. And the content of these surviving scriptures stands in direct, stark contradiction to fundamental Quranic theological assertions. The historical Bible clearly witnesses to the Trinity, the divine sonship of Jesus and his crucifixion, but the Quran explicitly denies all of those core doctrines.
Moving right along to Section 2, Anatomy of the Dilemma, and the concept of the logical fork.
Okay, let's really dive into this and break down how apologists construct this dilemma piece by piece. They present this juxtaposition as a formal constructive dilemma, basically a stark binary choice. Let's call them Horn A and Horn B. Horn A says, if the biblical scriptures present in the 7th century were textually preserved and reliable, well, then their core claims regarding the crucifixion and resurrection are true. Consequently, the Quran's denials of those events must be false. Now for Horn B, if those biblical scriptures were textually corrupted, then the Quran explicitly affirms, commands adherence to, and directs its own prophet to consult corrupted, untrustworthy writings. Therefore, apologists argue, whether the prior scriptures are preserved or corrupted, the internal claims of the Quran fail to logically cohere.
Now here's a really fascinating fact from the research regarding a term called Tahrif, which means wholesale textual corruption. A close analysis of early Quranic vocabulary actually shows an absence of any explicit doctrine of wholesale textual corruption applied to the entire Bible. When the Quran talks about alteration, it consistently accuses groups of twisting their tongues to misrepresent meaning, or maybe concealing specific passages. The critique is directed at specific scribal abuses, not some kind of global erasure of the canonical text possessed by the wider church or synagogue.
Up next is Section 3, From Antiquity to Algorithms, where we'll be tracing the argument.
You know, you might think this is just some modern internet-age debate tactic, but it actually has a rich, incredibly ancient pedigree. Way back in the 8th century, Christian theologians operating under Islamic rule, like the Syriac and Malkite apologists, realized the Quran's explicit deference to prior revelation gave them a very unique defense. By the 9th century, the Apology of Al-Kindi was actively pressing Muslim opponents on this exact logic. As debates intensified over the centuries, the 11th century Andalusian scholar Ibn Haz recognized the massive liability this posed to Islamic theology, so he advanced a decisive shift toward Tahrif al-Lafz, meaning the actual physical text itself was changed.
This was a doctrine of systematic, wholesale textual corruption. This huge defensive shift really paved the way for the arguments we see today in our modern digital era.
Fast forward to today, and contemporary figures have massively systematized this dilemma, totally accelerating its reach. In the late 90s and early 2000s, figures like Sam Shamoun systematically cataloged these verses. J. Smith famously integrated the argument into highly confrontational, physical debates at places like Speaker's Corner in London. And David Wood formalized the logic into its classical dilemma structure, popularizing the specific moniker, the Islamic Dilemma, through video essays and all sorts of digital platforms. This transition from physical, in-person debates to digital systematization has truly turned it into a primary tool for modern interfaith discussion.
Which brings us to Section 4, the tactical deployment, focusing on the pre-apologetic sequence.
So how is this tool actually used in a real, boots-on-the-ground debate? It usually follows a three-step tactical clearance. Step 1, the apologist establishes common ground, basically obligating the interlocutor to grant that Allah originally revealed true scriptures. Step 2, they force that binary choice based on 7th century historical realities, specifically pointing out that the Church possessed fully translated Old and New Testaments at that exact time in history. Step 3, they systematically address standard Muslim rejoinders. You could think of this whole process as clearing the conversational battlefield before the actual theological debate even begins. It's meant to completely dismantle the standard wall of the Bible is corrupted before the apologist ever even presents the gospel.
Now let's look at how debaters actually handle those standard counterarguments. For example, what if someone argues the Injil was just an oral book given to a Unitarian Jesus that simply vanished in the 1st century? Well, apologists will point to Surah 547, noting that 7th century Christians couldn't exactly be commanded to judge by a text that had supposedly been non-existent for 600 years. Or is it only a partial confirmation of the text? In response, apologists cite Surah 285, which strictly condemns believing in only a part of the book.
That leads perfectly into Section 5, Strengths and Limitations, for a quick academic evaluation.
Stepping back to weigh the evidence impartially, we see some clear strengths to this approach. It operates strictly from the opponent's own premises, it has deep historical roots, and it's backed up by really solid 4th to 7th century manuscript continuity. It is, frankly, a highly effective pedagogical tool. However, it definitely has serious limitations. For one, it's an internal critique. It doesn't actually positively prove Christianity. Furthermore, applying strict Aristotelian binary logic risks forcing modern frameworks onto late antique texts. And, if weaponized without charity, it can easily become reductively triumphalist rather than a genuine dialogue.
To expand on that just a bit, critical scholars like Sidney Griffith and Gabriel Sod Reynolds point out a pretty significant limitation. They emphasize that the Quran operates in a late antique homiletic environment, which basically means a culture heavily steeped in oral preaching and storytelling. In this specific context, the Quran might conceive of the Injil as a singular heavenly archetype delivered directly to Jesus, kind of parallel to how the Quran was given to Muhammad. It doesn't necessarily mean the fourfold narrative canonical Gospels compiled by the early Church. This nuance from academics definitely complicates the strict binary logic of the dilemma.
And finally, Section 6, the ultimate theological goal, looking at the Promise Plan framework.
So, why exactly do Christian apologists use this specific dilemma? The ultimate strategic reason leads us to Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s concept of promise plan theology. This is the idea that scriptural revelation unfolds organically around a central, unifying divine promise that is progressively revealed over time, rather than being periodically abrogated or just replaced by disconnected books. Clearing the Tahrif or corruption charge effectively opens the pathway to demonstrating this grand, unified narrative.
Let's see how this builds what they call a redemptive trajectory. The Promise Plan traces a continuous, unbroken line from the Proto-Evangelium, which is the very first promise of redemption found in Genesis 3, through the Abrahamic, Mosaic, and Davidic covenants, all the way to its absolute climax in Jesus the Messiah. This framework contrasts sharply with the Islamic narrative, which tends to view Revelation as isolated, disconnected books that replace one another. By vindicating the reliability of the prior scriptures, the apologist's ultimate goal is to lead the inquirer directly to the historical, organically unified, and theological reality of Jesus. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought to chew on. When sacred texts collide, does imposing strict structural logic clarify our understanding of interfaith dialogue, or does it actually complicate the rich nuances of late antique history? It's a profound question about how history, theology, and modern debate tactics all intersect. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those big questions.